Hi there. Today I was going to talk to you a little bit about the types of yarn that you use for weaving. My beginner weavers often ask me, and not everybody who comes to weaving has a background with knitting, so their knowledge of yarn might be limited. So hopefully I can help you out a little bit today to learn what works well for warping. So the first thing you need to learn when you're setting up your warp is your hetal. So if you're new to weaving, I'm going to explain a little bit about how your hetal sizing works. So this one here is the 8 dent hetal for the 15-inch shocked loom. And when they say 8 dent, they're referring to this white part in the hetal. It's called your reed. And 8 dent means that for every inch of hetal, there are 8 holes and slots. So the 8 dent one, that's the spacing on them. It's ideal for sock yarn, worsted weight. I wouldn't go a whole lot bigger than worsted weight with this. The reason I wouldn't is because if you get into like a chunky or super chunky, if you thread it through here when you're setting up the warp and it's rubbing against the sides repeatedly when you are weaving away, you'll find that it can start to fray the yarn and it's just not fun to work with. You want it to move smoothly. So when you're choosing your yarn, you're also going to be looking at your hetal. So when you choose that yarn, make sure that it slides easily through the holes and slots of your hetal, and then you're all set to warp with it. So another thing we want to look at is the integrity of the yarn. So I tell my beginners to start learning to warp with maybe an acrylic or a wool that have some stretch to it. That'll be very forgiving when you're learning how, see how there's stretch to that. When you're learning, that give will be very forgiving for you. So acrylic works really well. I know it's not very glamorous and you want to get into all the fancy yarns, but give yourself a few projects. You have to walk before you can run. So I always tell them, try and do just a few simple scarves or table runners with acrylic or an inexpensive yarn, just to get your edges and your spacing down. And then you can go on to all the beautiful things. And you just donate the scarves to one of your local shelters or something like that. Just get your practice time in. So if you are using something like this acrylic, it's worsted, it's nice. You can look at it, the width is nice. It will fit through an 8 dent hetal very nicely. And you want it to be strong. So the key thing we're looking at here is the integrity. So I give it the tug test and it's just fine. It's nice and strong. And one of the things that makes it strong is that it's multi-ply. So when we refer to the ply of the yarn, it's how many individual strands have been plied together, put together into that twist to create the yarn. So you look here, this one has 4 strands that have been plied together. So that gives it much integrity. It will be fantastic for a warp. Generally speaking, sock yarns are wonderful as well. Certain sock yarns have a tighter twist than others, and they all seem to work fairly decently as long as they're multi-ply. You want to make sure that there are multiple little strands that will give it your strength. Another thing you're going to be looking at, aside from the ply, is what is attached to the yarn. So some of the novelty yarns, when we look at some of these fuzzy ones and that, they're absolutely beautiful. And they can add a lot to your weaving to have some nice strands. That one's like really fuzzy. It's good and strong, so it passes the tug test. And when you warp with it, the key thing for this type of yarn that you want to look for is that it does slide nicely through your hetal. There's nothing wrong with using it, but just make sure that you're using the right hetal with it. That works. Like the same thing goes for like the eyelash yarn and that, and I hate knitting with it, but it weaves nicely and it adds some interest and some fluff to your project. Another thing you can look at are some of these, I don't know, kind of wobbly looking yarns and some of the hand spun yarns. They can be very interesting, and you can see here that it's very thin here and then it gets very thick. That's fantastic. It adds a really interesting look to your weaving. Make sure it passes. Oh, see, look at that. Doesn't pass the tug test. It comes right apart. Make sure that it does pass the test before you warp with it. It weaves beautifully, so you can put that on your shuttle And that type of yarn will give you a very interesting, almost wave in it because of it getting thicker and thinner throughout. So that's another type of yarn that's fantastic for weaving. And once you are proficient in your warping, and once you feel pretty confident that your tension is even across your entire warp, definitely move on to some of the yarns that are rigid. So things like bamboo and cotton, and that there's no give to them. They tend to be fairly rigid, and they make for beautiful weaving. You can do all your tea towels and all of those lovely items with your cottons, and they have lots of integrity. Most of the cottons have multiple ply, so they have that nice strength to them. The mercerized cotton, that's what this one here, mercerized, and what that means is in the finishing of the yarn, it's the way they treat it. It strengthens the yarn, and it also takes the dye a lot better when they mercerize it. So that is that's a fantastic type of yarn to use for your warp. When you're weaving, the part that for your weft that you're actually weaving, you can weave with almost anything. If you can create a strip with it that can pass in your shed, then you can weave with it. So once you get a nice strong warp onto your loom, grab some of the interesting, the novelty stuff. I've got some recycled sari material. It would not make a great warp because it's a single ply, but it will weave beautifully. You can use it in your weft and it will look absolutely stunning. There's banana fiber. That's another really interesting one. It's really heavy, but it could add something really interesting to your project. And I've got some interesting bits of hand spun yarn, and that can add just a beautiful pattern into it. So when you're setting everything up, keep in mind the key elements is that it fits through your hetal nicely, that you have a yarn that has integrity and multi-ply for the warp, and then have fun with your weaving. So let me know if you have any questions that I can help you with as a beginner weaver, and I'm happy to do some more videos for you. I hope everybody is safe and happy weaving. We all have lots of extra time right now to weave. So stay safe and take care from the Violet Unicorn in Nova Scotia, Canada.